Congressman Cantor, Congressman and Mrs. Goodlatte, Mr. Ramsey, members of the Board of Visitors, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Louthen, honored guests, members of the Corps of Cadets, faculty and staff, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to today's program in the H.B. Johnson 26 Distinguished Lecture Series. Begun in 1984 by Mr. Belton Kleberg Johnson of Texas in honor of his father, this series has so far brought 45 national and international outstanding leaders to VMI. Each speaker has added considerably to the educational experience of our cadets and to the cultural experience of this community. This morning, it is my great pleasure to welcome today's speaker, the Honorable Eric Cantor, U.S. Representative from Virginia's 7th Congressional District and House Majority Leader. A member of the Republican Party, Congressman Cantor entered the U.S. House of Representatives on January 3, 2001, representing Virginia's 7th District, which includes much of Richmond and areas to the north and to the west. Prior to going to Washington, he served in the Virginia House of Delegates from the 73rd District. And during his first term in the U.S. House, he was chairman of the Congressional Task Force on Terrorism and Unconventional Warfare. In 2002, he was appointed Chief Deputy Republican Whip. And in November 2008, he was appointed Republican Whip for the 111th Congress. Congressman Cantor became House Majority Leader when the 112th Congress took office on the 3rd of January 2011, a position he still holds in the 113th Congress. His position makes him the second-ranking Republican in the House behind Speaker of the House, John Boehner. In foreign policy, Congressman Cantor is a proponent of a strong national defense, a strong U.S.-Israel relationship, and free trade. In domestic policy, he is consistently conservative in his approach to economic growth, social issues, and especially job creation. He has earned a reputation as a strategic thinker and an ideas-driven conservative. In the fall of 2010, he wrote a New York Times best-selling book, Young Guns, A New Generation of Conservative Leaders, with two other founders of the GOP Young Guns program, this group which includes Representative Kevin McCarthy and Representative Paul Ryan. They have stated that their vision is a clear agenda based on common sense for the common good. Congressman Cantor attended the Collegiate School in Richmond. He was graduated from George Washington University and earned a law degree from the William & Mary Law School and an MS degree in real estate from Columbia University. He and his wife Diana reside in Richmond, and they have 3 children. The Congressional Quarterly has described him as the GOP's communicator, rainmaker, and consensus builder. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Congressman Eric Cantor.
General, thank you very much for that kind introduction, and good morning. General, to you, to the administrators, to the faculty, to the members of the Board of Trustees, to the cadets, to my fellow colleague, Chairman Bob Goodlatte from Roanoke and his wife, Mary Ellen, it is a great honor to be with you today. I can think of no better place than the Virginia Military Institute to discuss American foreign policy, to discuss the way forward for an America that leads, an America that strives for peace, yet is prepared for conflict. To all the cadets here today, one day soon, our nation will rely on you, as we've relied on graduates of VMI since the first class was admitted in 1839. We must do our best to bestow upon you a secure and stable world. We must protect the security of our nation, the liberty of our allies, and freedom for all. Today, we celebrate our nation's first Commander-in-Chief, George Washington. Since Washington led our armed forces and this nation, America has relied upon a strong military to defend our homeland and our freedom. America's military strength and global leadership has always been combined with a benevolent purpose. America has helped spread the promise of democracy to the oppressed, the message of hope to the destitute, and the blessing of security to the weak. In doing so, we have earned new allies, vanquished old foes, and further secured our own nation. But today, that formula that has served this nation and the world so well is very much in doubt. America's friends worry we've lost our way, that we have lost the will to live up to our values and stand up to aggressors. They see a divided, inward-looking America that is focused on its weaknesses rather than its strengths. They know that this is an America that invites challenges and emboldens adversaries. Many Americans and politicians from both parties want to believe that the tide of war has receded. As was the case in the wake of World War I, many want to believe the costly foreign interventions of recent years can simply be put behind us, that we can simply choose not to be involved. However, we must not forget the lessons of history. I recently led a congressional delegation to the Nazi death camps at Auschwitz and Birkenau to commemorate the 69th anniversary of their liberation. As an American and a Jew, I was struck by a torrent of emotions filled with horror, pride, and regret. Horror at the scale of the camps and the industrialization of human slaughter. These death camps are places of pure evil. They are cauldrons of hatred that even today shock the conscience at how brutal human beings can be if left unchecked. Pride in America's role in liberating Europe from Nazism and ending the Holocaust. American GIs and our allies liberated concentration camps across the European continent. Our greatest generation made tremendous sacrifices that were essential to defeating Nazi Germany. And standing there as the frigid wind swept through the eerily quiet ruins of the camps, I could not help but regret that American action in World War II came too late to save countless millions of innocent lives. Hitler's rise and conquest of Europe did not come as a surprise, nor were the Allied powers ignorant of the Nazi death camps to which millions of innocents were being shipped like cattle, bound for their slaughter. The free world chose not to act against Hitler's aggression until it was too late. Americans, war-weary and anxious after experiencing the horrors of World War I, largely ignored the conflict erupting on the continent. The prevailing sentiment was to avoid involvement in the burgeoning conflicts in Europe and Asia. This isolationist sentiment lasted years until the bombing of Pearl Harbor woke the American people from their slumber. We must not repeat the same mistake. We must not reduce our preparedness or accept the notion that this nation is one of many. We must not cede global leadership to others. The world is still dangerous and is getting smaller as technological advances bring disparate conflicts closer and closer to our shores. The outcome of these conflicts have real consequences for America's security and prosperity. Now is not the time to ignore these looming challenges. American foreign policy should not be guided by hollow rhetoric, unwise or movable timelines, and unenforced red lines. Instead, it should be driven by clear principles: protect the homeland, defend our allies, advance freedom, democracy, and human rights abroad, while maintaining a military superiority that is second to none. Human nature has not changed since World War II. Evil and hateful ideologies still exist in this world. We run a terrible risk if we fail to recognize and confront such evil before it is too late. Perhaps this is most evident in Iran's determined march to produce nuclear weapons. I can imagine few more destabilizing moments in world history than in Iran on the threshold of becoming a nuclear power. Make no mistake, Iran is a brutal theocracy. Its leaders violently repress dissent at home and support conflict and chaos abroad. For years, our State Department has listed Iran as the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism. Many of our troops and innocent American civilians, to say nothing of the Arabs and Jews, have lost their lives at the hands of Hezbollah and other Iranian proxies. Now, some view Iran's new president, Hassan Rouhani, as a moderate and a reformer. But Mr. Rouhani is actually far less powerful than Qasem Soleimani, the commander of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps' elite Quds force. And he is insignificant next to Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, whom they call the supreme leader for a reason. Khamenei's bid for regional supremacy has led Iran to support Bashar Assad's war against the Syrian people, where hundreds of thousands of people have been slaughtered. If given the opportunity, Iran's leaders would make good on their call to wipe Israel off the map. Armed with nuclear weapons, Iran would be a threat to all within range of their missiles, which someday soon may include our own shores. The international community must confront this growing threat. In truth, the international community will only act if it is encouraged to do so by an America that leads. Like all Americans, I hope to see Iran abandon its nuclear aspirations through peaceful negotiations. But hope is not a strategy. Among other shortcomings, the current interim agreement between the U.S. and Iran explicitly allows Iran to continue enriching uranium and improving its centrifuge designs. This despite UN Security Council resolutions that call for Iran to suspend exactly these activities. If Iran is to become a threshold nuclear state, there will be no stopping regional states like Saudi Arabia and Turkey from also pursuing the bomb. And it is hard to believe such an arms race will be confined to the Middle East. Decades of efforts to stop the spread of nuclear weapons will become meaningless if the nuclear barn door is kicked open by the world's most active sponsor of state terrorism. The United States must remain firm. Already, the limited sanctions relief provided by the interim deal has undermined the perception of international pressure that is critical to convincing Iranians to change course. Not a week goes by without reports of foreign trade delegations heading to Tehran. Sanctions may technically remain in place, but the undeniable impression is that Iran is open for business. So as we hold the line on the firm demand that Iran come into compliance with the UN Security Council, an America that leads is an America that restores the badly eroded international pressures on Tehran. We should lay the groundwork now for additional sanctions in the event Iran violates the terms of the interim agreement. Iran's nuclear program must remain our urgent focus, but we must not lose sight of the threat posed by Iran's continued development of ballistic missiles, its support for terrorism, its efforts to foment instability in the region and its brutal repression of its own population. Our diplomatic efforts to convince Iran to give up its nuclear design and change its ways must be accompanied with a credible threat of the use of military force. Unfortunately, America's actions in recent years have demonstrated otherwise. This has led to distrust among our allies and the strengthening of our adversaries. Syria is a big reason our allies do not trust us and our adversaries do not fear us. Months into Syrian dictator Bashar Assad's brutal suppression of a nationwide protest movement, momentum appeared to be with the protesters. President Obama, sensing perhaps that Assad's fall was inevitable, called for the dictator to go. In doing so, the president violated Lyndon Johnson's maxim that you shouldn't tell a man to go to hell unless you're prepared to send him there. President Obama's declaration, in the eyes of the world, and especially in the eyes of the Syrians, committed the U.S. to a policy of regime change. But the absence of a strategy to accomplish this objective has strengthened Assad and weakened our credibility. When Assad prepared to use chemical weapons against his own people, President Obama warned that doing so would cross a red line for which there would be serious consequences. And yet, when credible reports surfaced that Assad had in fact used chemical weapons against his own people, President Obama referred action to the UN. And then in August, Assad's forces used chemical weapons so egregiously that YouTube videos of suffering victims showed up almost instantaneously on the internet. It then appeared the U.S. could finally enforce the red line drawn by our president. We needed to inflict serious consequences on a brutal dictator aligned with Iran and restore some of America's tarnished credibility. And yet, having led our allies and adversaries in the Middle East to believe we'd strike, America backed down. The administration leaped at Russian President Vladimir Putin's concrete life preserver of a plan to have the UN get rid of Assad's chemical weapons. 6 months later, Assad remains in power, still has his chemical weapons, and looks unlikely to ever fully get rid of them. Of course, Assad's chemical weapons are but a sideshow. Syria is not merely a humanitarian disaster, but a slow-motion strategic catastrophe that poses significant threats to America and some of its closest partners. It is not merely someone else's civil war, but a regional sectarian conflict that has become a vortex of jihad. Already, more foreign fighters have flocked to Syria than fought in Iraq and Afghanistan. These foreigners, including hundreds from Europe, many from the United States, and some from far away as Indonesia and Australia, pose a particular risk. Radicalized and battle-hardened, these jihadists are armed with Western passports and could return home to continue their fight. This month, Director of National Intelligence James Clapper and Homeland Security Secretary Jay Johnson both acknowledged that these radicalized foreign fighters pose a threat to our homeland. Now, there are no risk-free options in Syria, nor will the resolution of this terrible conflict be easy, as our partners in the region have begged for more than a year. An America that leads is an America that must do more. We must coordinate an international effort to support the moderate opposition, to bolster them in their fight against the forces of Assad, Iran, and al-Qaeda. We must lead in order to change the balance of power on the ground to make possible a negotiated political solution to this conflict. Now, such support will not guarantee that moderate rebels can defeat the extremists, but their fate and ours will almost certainly be bleak without it. Our failure to act in Syria not only undermined our allies inside Syria and throughout the Middle East, but it also badly shook our allies in Asia. South Korean and Japanese leaders rightfully question whether they can trust the United States to stand up to a nuclear-armed North Korea if we cannot follow through on our threats against a much weaker Syria. North Korea has made considerable, virtually unimpeded progress in its nuclear weapons and ballistic missile programs since 2009. It has unveiled a previously secret industrial-sized uranium enrichment program. It has conducted multiple nuclear tests, test-fired multiple ballistic missiles, including ICBMs capable of reaching the United States. And North Korea has conducted artillery and naval attacks against our ally South Korea and its vessels and territory. Yet, North Korea has faced almost no consequence for flouting the demands of the international community. It has yet to pay any meaningful price for nearly a decade of illegal support to Syria's nuclear program, including helping the Syrian regime build a covert nuclear reactor. Iran, a long-standing proliferation partner of North Korea, has undoubtedly learned a valuable lesson from watching America's unwillingness to prevent North Korea's emergence as a nuclear power. An America that leads is an America that must redouble its efforts to support a nuclear, to stop a nuclear North Korea and stand by and support our allies, South Korea. Now, this should include bringing China along as a partner that is committed to restraining and reforming North Korea. We got to work to increase international sanctions, expand efforts to crack down on North Korea's proliferation of missile and nuclear technology, and engage in joint military exercises with our regional allies. Above all, we must put an end to the pattern of North Korean aggression. This should be followed by a request for dialogue that makes clear that any future economic concessions require North Korea's denuclearization. Our partners in Asia look to the United States to stand with them to promote international peace and security and to guarantee freer markets and freer trade. But these allies have witnessed America's retreat in the Middle East, and they are fearful that the U.S. will pull back in Asia as well. And for them, such a retreat would expose previously secure freer sea lanes of navigation and increasing territorial competition. And as we've seen elsewhere, an America that fails to lead produces a vacuum that others are eager to fill. China's continued growth into an economic power poses tremendous opportunities for increased trade and global economic growth. But China's neighbors are worried that economic strength of the People's Republic, combined with its increasing military might, will embolden its leaders to behave more aggressively in the region. These neighbors, our allies, do desire good relations with China, but they need U.S. leadership to make that happen. America must encourage China to wield its new influence responsibly and in accord with international law to respect freedom of navigation and the territorial integrity of its neighbors. Initially encouraged by the so-called pivot or rebalance to Asia, our Asian allies are rightfully worried that the rebalance means only that the region will receive a larger slice of a shrinking pie with respect to America's attention, military presence, and diplomacy. Now, we cannot carry the load for our partners, but an America that leads is America that provides the guidance, security, and coordination necessary to keep the peace. Global leadership is not possible if America does not invest in a modern, highly trained, well-equipped, and more lethal military. We must invest in combating new threats, including in the field of cybersecurity, where state and non-state actors pose a risk to our secrets and critical infrastructure. We cannot continue to blindly reduce defense spending, or we'll find it increasingly difficult to project adequate military power in any theater, be it the Middle East, Latin America, or Asia. Our ability to promote peace and stability must be accompanied by a willingness to lead and engage on matters of free trade. The President is right to seek a new free trade agreement in Asia. Free markets and free trade helps to generate economic growth on both sides of the Pacific and gives nations an incentive to play by the rules of international trade. This has been the case in Latin America, where trade agreements have served us well, strengthening alliances with and promoting economic growth in countries like Colombia. The United States must work to expand free trade and free markets. We must also speak out against socialistic populist economic policies that lead to economic and social ruin. It is perhaps our best course of action to produce meaningful stability in our own neighborhood in Latin and South America. An America that leads in our own hemisphere is an America that restores the role of important multilateral organizations such as the Organization of American States. We must work to promote security, free markets, and political reform. Socialist leaders in the Americas are taking advantage of U.S. disengagement to organize themselves against our interests. They, in turn, undermine their neighbors who are otherwise committed to democracy, the rule of law, and free markets. Look no further than Russia, a traditional ally to leftist regimes in Latin America, to see the consequences of disengagement. When President Obama came to office, he seemed intent on engaging an old adversary and extended a hand to Russian President Vladimir Putin. Secretary Clinton famously pressed a reset button to symbolize a new start to a more harmonious relationship with Russia. Well, despite the idyllic pictures from the Olympic coverage at Sochi, Putin is still living in the Cold War. He has demonstrated that he's neither interested in better relations with the United States, nor is he fearful of poking America in the eye. Just in the last year, Putin has blocked UN Security Council resolutions, provided lethal support to Bashar Assad's Syria, threatened the independence of Russia's neighbors in Eastern Europe, and suppressed dissent at home. He's even rolled out the red carpet for a traitor, Edward Snowden, whose theft of sensitive classified information has done serious damage to America's security. Now, we should acknowledge the truth about Putin and his government. An America that leads must have policies based on a clear understanding that Russia often behaves like an adversary, seeking every opportunity to undermine our interests and push its advantage. We should work with Russia when doing so is in our interests. But we should also speak clearly against Russia's aggression abroad and its repression at home. There have been recent reports of Russia's violations of the INF Treaty, to which the United States has failed to respond. These reports raise profound concerns about Russia's trustworthiness as an arms control partner, either with respect to a new bilateral reduction treaty such as New START or multilateral negotiations with Iran. Russia's behavior and the growing threat posed by proliferation are stark reminders that the U.S. must maintain a credible nuclear deterrent capability. This has been paramount in providing security to allies around the world. We could learn a lot from President Ronald Reagan, who understood the value of an America that leads. Reagan's clarity of vision and strength of purpose in calling for Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev to tear down this wall inspired millions behind the Iron Curtain. He made clear to Soviet leaders that America would not be pushed around. Reagan's clarity of purpose and commitment to rebuilding America's strength compelled Soviet leaders to make concessions on groundbreaking arms control agreements. This paved the way to the end of the Cold War. An America that leads must regain its clarity of purpose and commitment to prevail for freedom's sake. Citizens fighting for freedom in their own countries look to us for this strength of purpose. And when our voice is absent, we lose the chance to help moderates emulate the U.S. in building pluralistic democracies. Unfortunately, this is the case in the cold winter that followed the popular uprisings against regimes in the Middle East, known as the Arab Spring. There, moderate reformers floundered and extremists filled a vacuum. And what we now see is the Talibanization of the Middle East. Just as we failed to capitalize on the promise of the Arab Spring, we failed to combat the dangerous growth of instability and extremism in Libya before it was too late. Far from demonstrating the success of the Obama administration's light footprint approach, Libya today barely exists as a state. It is a vast, ungoverned stretch of desert, awash in weapons where terrorists, gangs, and militiamen compete for local dominance. Now, this didn't happen overnight. The U.S. did not acknowledge and confront the growing lawlessness and instability that sprung from the collapse of the Gaddafi regime. In fact, administration officials continued publicly to present Libya as a success. When reports of violent attacks against Western interests in Libya, including the city of Benghazi, became common, the State Department ignored them. It chose neither to increase security at its diplomatic facilities nor to change its broader Libya policy. The catastrophic result of inaction is obvious. 4 Americans, including the U.S. ambassador to Libya, are dead. Since that deadly day, no one has paid a price for this outrageous attack. No one has been brought to justice. What message does it send to the terrorists that an American ambassador can be killed with apparent impunity? The situation in Libya continues to deteriorate. Libya today has become a safe haven from which terrorists threaten stability in neighboring countries. Libyan weapons have shown up throughout the region, including in the Sinai, where terrorists have attacked Egypt, they've attacked a multinational observer force, and they've attacked Israel. Libya cannot be allowed to become an Afghanistan on the Mediterranean. An America that leads should seek to bolster the capabilities of the Libyan security forces and, as necessary, be willing to engage in and support counterterrorism efforts. Next door to Libya, Tunisia is perhaps the democratic transition in the Arab world that's most likely to succeed. However, it faces significant challenges compounded by America's disengagement from the region. Recent political compromises between the major secular and Islamist parties offer hope that Tunisia's democracy will take root. America can help the Tunisians seize this opportunity that the newfound compromise provides. An America that leads must stand on the side of the moderates as they struggle to build pluralistic democratic societies. Now, democracy is not just about elections, and it doesn't happen overnight. If democracy is to take root in the Middle East, it'll require significant protections for individual rights, religious minorities, and women, protections that will not materialize if the region lacks a partner to help guide the way. Now, for those who think the events in the region do not impact our security at home, let us think again. Recall that in the 1990s, when the Taliban took control of Afghanistan after a bitter civil war, we consoled ourselves that Afghanistan was far away, that it was simply someone else's civil war. Our blindness to the emergence of a terrorist state in Afghanistan paved the way for the attacks of September 11, 2001. Unfortunately, too many brave young men and women who once sat where you sit today have since made the ultimate sacrifice in the war on terror. After many years and many missteps, the plain truth is we still have a lot of work to do in Afghanistan. It'd be a terrible mistake for the United States to make the same error we've made in Iraq. Our hasty and complete withdrawal squandered the hard-fought, costly gains won by our military. Afghan soldiers who have fought side by side with Americans worry that the Taliban and other enemies will relish a full-scale American retreat. One Afghan officer warned that if the Americans leave, Afghanistan will be a lone sheep left in the desert for the wolves to eat. In Iraq today, Iran and al-Qaeda are ascendant, and violence has reached levels not seen since the peak of the insurgency. To allow the same thing to happen in Afghanistan would invite strategic defeat for the U.S. George Marshall's America did not abandon Europe to Soviet totalitarianism. Ronald Reagan's America, though weary of a 40-year struggle against communism, did not give in to the temptation to call it a day. Our generation's America cannot abandon our allies to the wolves. Today, we must recapture the spirit and commitment of an America that leads. The inconvenient truth is, politics of retreat and retrenchment make conflict more likely. A failure to acknowledge the continuing threat posed by extremists emboldens our enemies and leaves us, America, vulnerable. Osama bin Laden may be dead, but the threat posed by radical Islamic terrorists has not diminished, and this is not a law enforcement problem. Al-Qaeda, its affiliates, and similar extremist groups have established an array of camps, safe havens, and financing networks that would make bin Laden proud. Though once confined to the remote wastelands of Sudan and the mountains of Afghanistan, radical Islamic terrorists are now on the move from the western reaches of Africa to the tribal areas of Pakistan. Indeed, some of these groups, from Yemen to Libya, seek to attack American interests and even our homeland. The tide of war is not receding, it is flowing. An America that leads must have a renewed determination to wage the battle for moderation over extremism. The effort must include a strategy to shape the outcome of the broader political transformations underway in the Middle East. We've got to renew partnerships with long allies who now feel abandoned, and we must take aggressive actions against terrorist leaders. We must help build partner capacity in the Middle East and North Africa. This should include training and equipping security forces in other countries so they can be more reliable partners in providing for their own security and in stabilizing their troubled region. Now, the President and leaders of Congress must also be honest with the American people that all of these efforts cannot be done on the cheap, and they cannot be accomplished without risks. This must be a part of a renewed effort to ensure that each defense dollar is well spent and that we are committed to being ready for the threats of the future. As President Obama himself has said, inaction tears at our conscience and can lead to more costly intervention later. Now, these words must begin to actually inform our strategy. Our soldiers who carry out these missions are our greatest strength, and they've proven it by living up to a maxim that I know you're quite familiar with. In peace, a glorious asset. In war, a tower of strength. As a member of Congress, I have the great privilege of meeting many of our brave military men and women, but I also meet with families of the fallen. It is an extremely humbling experience. Only they truly know the feeling of a folded flag and the emotions that come with a loved one paying the ultimate sacrifice. Let me conclude with a story. A few months ago, I was invited to attend a ceremony to rename the American Legion Post 186 in Midlothian for Major Charles A. Ransom, an Air Force officer killed in Afghanistan. As I listened to Major Ransom's family and friends honor him at that ceremony, it was clear to me he was a natural-born leader who displayed a great love for his country. He was a man who lived his life by wisdom and courage. I was not the least bit surprised when I was told that Major Charles Ransom was a graduate of VMI. We must remember that the world needs an America that leads. America needs more men like Major Charles Ransom. We honor Major Ransom and we honor you, tomorrow's servicemen and women, by having a foreign policy rooted in American strength and humility with clear purpose and unwavering certainty. We must never let our allies or enemies doubt our commitment to these principles. If we champion the values this country was founded on, and we embrace our role as a world leader, America won't just be a beacon of hope and freedom for the next 100 years, but for centuries to come. Thank you all very much, and God bless you, and God bless the Commonwealth. God bless the United States of America.
Congressman Cantor, on behalf of the Corps Cadets, I would like to just personally thank you for coming to speak to us today. I'm going to offer you this gift as a form of our appreciation for you coming out today. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you very much for your remarks today, Congressman Cantor. These proceedings are adjourned. Thank you.